Welcome back to another episode of Be Real Talks. I'm the host, Sophia Gibri. Today I have with us Mone't Schultz. She graduated from Binghamton University in 2018 with a bachelor's in sociology. As a BU student, she led the Black Student Union, was a member of the Binghamton Speech and Debate Team, and participated in other socio-political initiatives. She came to Binghamton University by way of Queens, New York, where she resided for the last 14 years after immigrating from Guyana, South America. She currently works for a top litigation law firm in Midtown, New York, and is on her journey to law school, where she intends to practice impact litigation. Today, we're going to be discussing Mone's experiences in the workplace, and we're particularly going to be focusing on her experiences in law. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey everyone, my name is Mone't Schultz, as Sophia just mentioned, and I'm happy to be here.
Great. So first kind of question, an introduction to who you are. When I was first introduced to you, the person described you as pro-Black. So I want to get a sense of what that means from your perspective.
Right. So I think that when we talk about being pro-Black, a lot of people are like, oh my God, afros and this stuff, right? But that's not necessarily like just what it is, right? So my understanding of being pro-Black comes from understanding the disenfranchisement of the Black diaspora. And what that means to me is I'm very intentional in the harm reduction that I'm bringing to my community, right? So that means that using my social advancements that I've been able to grab from one way or another to uplift my community, So for example, right, only like the system, when we say the system, we understand like the socio-political things that exist, really only allows some of us to make it to higher education, right? So I think that it's my duty that since I've been able to cross that barrier, I see my purpose in sort of bridging the gap between my community that is formally educated and what we would consider the organic intellectual, right? Those that are educated through their life experiences and things of that nature. So being pro-Black is really just understanding, what has happened in the Black community over a period of decades or centuries, and using your position to assist in a healthy revival of our community.
Great. Yeah, I love that. That's very empowering, very rooted in understanding, your history and education around that. So kind of like the other side of a different question is, what are some of your thoughts on some of the common stereotypes often associated with Black women in the workplace? And then kind of based on your experience, how can students really address those stereotypes?
I think that when it comes to Black women in the workplace, there's a mirage of things that I think is associated with what that looks like in corporate America, specifically law firms. In my experience, I would say that the most common sort of thing that we see is the angry Black woman stereotype. And the way that plays out, and I guess the nuance behind that, it's that women are oftentimes already seen as, overly emotional or irate or things of that nature, right? So when you put Black in front of that, you see the intersection between sex and race, right? And how that plays in. So the Black woman that has something to say is oftentimes, geared as an angry Black woman or, someone that is like too aggressive. Aggressive is something that usually permeates the workspace or, seeps into. So I've seen that happen in multiple ways. Fortunately, I haven't been the reciprocant of that as far as I can tell. I think instances have happened to where that has sort of been at play, but the way that I have been able to navigate it is just being very transparent and very concise in my communication style, and making sure that I'm very clear about what I'm saying and why I'm saying it and how I'm saying it, right? I think that there's certain levels of things that just are not acceptable in the workplace, regardless of your race and your gender. But when, a normal conversation is colored a certain way, I understand that says more about the person on the receiving end of that conversation than it does about me, because I've been able to set up strategies to make sure that stereotype is not colored onto me. And even if it is, I understand that is not, what's actually happening there because of, the dynamics of the corporate world. So yeah, I think that that's the biggest one that we see a lot in the corporate world.
Mm-hmm. So your main approach would be effective communication then, I guess, and kind of self-monitoring?
Right. Yeah, self-monitoring, effective communication, but understanding that that may still happen regardless of how you try to mitigate that. Usually what I tell other Black women and just Black men in general, or just minorities is, and I think that it's just a good practice, is to just keep things in writing. That way everything is referenceable, and that's something that's worked for me. And I think that, if something is taken out of context after it's been in writing, that's a different conversation that needs to be had about how certain people are being viewed in that space.
Yeah, I think that's really solid advice, especially sometimes it's worth sending an email instead of having that conversation so you can kind of have that paper trail, right?
Right, definitely. Or even, sending it prior to having an uncomfortable conversation. I've had an instance where a colleague had, treated me in a way that she had never treated our counterparts before, right? Stepped over me. And I addressed it, in the moment, in a very, neutral way, because it was a conference meeting. I sternly let her know, no, that's not what's happening. That's not what we're going to do, but we'll discuss this after the meeting. And prior to the meeting, I emailed her and just said, hey, blank, what you did in the meeting was very uncomfortable for these several reasons. And I would like to meet with you to speak about, this interaction. And I think that that kind of, lays out the framework to what the conversation is, so that there's no room for misinterpretation or any of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you're just, open, having that conversation, right? Don't be hesitant about it, even though it may be uncomfortable.
Right. You have to. As we're learning today, race is a very uncomfortable thing for most people to discuss, whether you're on either ends of the spectrum. Sometimes I guess, whiteness is more uncomfortable in discussing it because you guys, or white folks, are viewed as sort of the oppressors, right? Because of systematic setups. So I think that it's important that, people of color, and specifically Black women, when you are engaging in that conversation, understand that there's going to be a fear or a pushback or some level of uncomfortability. So it helps you to sort of lay out the conversation that you're going to go into prior to that, so the other person can sort of prepare themselves for that conversation, if you intend to have like a soluble outcome. If you don't want it to just be a clashing of minds, right? You want to have an actual discussion, a dialogue about what did or didn't occur. And you should give them, that in the corporate world, you should give that sort of playing ground so that that can happen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And can you kind of talk to us further about challenges that you faced as a Black woman in your field, or it could be any aspect of your identity that you feel really can answer this question?
So I think that for most Black women, and I would also say Black men too, and just Black people in general, even if they're like non-binary, I think that most of us face the challenge of sort of getting in the door. But also when you get in the door, it's can sometimes be very isolating, right? For example, if you work in a space where there aren't many people of color, and tragedies are happening on a collective scale, right? So we can look at the Ahmaud Arbery situation, we can look at Breonna Taylor, we can look at George Floyd, which is the most popular one right now. Imagine what that feels like to be Black in that space when like the news hits that morning, right? And you go into work and, everyone is acting as if, nothing has happened, because this doesn't necessarily affect them at the same level, but we kind of live sort of like double lives, right? Because before we even make it to work, we've gotten all of this information. We know what's happening to our community, and we still have to go into the office and go into our spaces, our respective spaces, and, perform at a level of professionalism under the mental agony or stress that we're at, and sometimes if you do have a few other people of color in the space, you can't necessarily just assume that because someone is a person of color, or just because, they're not a person of color, that, they feel one way or the other about situations. You understand? So sometimes it could be a very tricky thing, right? Because you can talk to a person of color about it and they might not feel the same way. You can talk to someone who's white about it and they might empathize more with that, right? So it's like we operate in a space where you just really you never really know, so that sort of makes it very isolating at times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super solid claims, right? It gets at the point of people of color are just as diverse as white people, right? So that's something that needs to be acknowledged, and to not assume that people feel one way or the other about these traumatic events. Just be really mindful of how people are feeling, and, being sure that you're not kind of coming at them overly apologetically or just acting like nothing's happening, right? It's all about kind of finding that balance.
Right.
And have you personally ever experienced any biases due to notions of professionalism?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But because, I am sociologist, sometimes I identify them and allow them to roll off my back. But I think that the most common thing that I don't think a lot of people even know that they're showing their implicit bias is like the consistent commentary on Black women's hair. We don't, with all intents and purposes, we just really don't care. Like, don't, leave us, we didn't ask for the commentary, we're not soliciting it, we don't want you to tell us about how unique our braids are. We don't want you to tell us about, wow, did your hair grow overnight when you change a hairstyle? You know what I mean? Those sorts of comments, it's like, at this point, we sort of all expect it because it's just something that is sort of normalized in the workspace. But if I had to change anything about that, I would definitely change that, because it's like, imagine every time you come to work and you change your lipstick color, someone had to say something about your lipstick color. It's like, wow, why? Why are you commenting on my lipstick? I didn't ask you, But yeah, I think this is very different from just giving a general comment, right? Like, or a general compliment, like, oh, wow, you look really nice today. Or like, oh, that suits. But the consistent, oh, how'd you do your hair like that? Is that your hair? How do you braid? How do you twist? It's too much. It's too much. Stop it. If anyone's watching this, stop it. Yeah.
I love that, because this topic literally came up today, right? And someone was like, what do I do? What do I say? And you yourself, I know every response is going to be different, but you really drew out nicely, from my perspective anyway, how there's a difference between a compliment and all of a sudden like an interrogation almost, right? Like, how do you twist? How do you braid? Is that your hair? It's like, okay, first of all, you bought it, so regardless, it's yours. Right. But just all these assumptions, and you're really showing like how that feels for you, for the person on the receiving end. So
and it's also unpaid labor. Here I am sitting here explaining this to you. Here I am sitting here using the time that I have to decide whether or not I should explain this, or decide whether or not, my explanation is going to make you feel uncomfortable. When, if you are really that, curious, Google is so free. Did you guys know that? We have not been censored yet. Google is so free. It is right there. So you're asking us to do a level of labor that you're not paying us for, right? That, which is called sort of what is it cost? What is the term for it? I think that it's like the inclusion tax. That's exactly what it is. It's called inclusion tax in corporate America, where you have to do housekeeping work to just exist in a space. So you're explaining things that wouldn't normally need to be explained, or you're doing this or you're doing that. So I would implore folks to stop doing that.
Nice. Hopefully they heard you. So looking kind of more about your experience in law, what have your experiences working for bigger firms versus smaller firms been like?
So I've worked at two law offices. right now I work for a smaller top litigation firm. Prior to that, I worked for a public interest firm. That's one of the largest firms that exists, or the oldest, largest, one of those things. I would say that I definitely prefer my experience at a smaller firm. That's just because for me personally, I'm an interpersonal kind of person. So I like to be very familiar with who I'm working with and understand them and really, build sort of as much as a community as, we can build at a workplace. And I think working at a smaller firm, allows that in a way that working at a bigger firm doesn't. I know lots of people that work at the big firms with the big names and in the 6-7 floors. And in my experience, when they do their job, they're just a person that does a job, that sits in a chair at a desk on this floor. At my firm, I am Monet that works with this person that also is on this initiative that does this and who likes to have this sort of food daily. You understand? So there's a level of interpersonal relationship that happens at a smaller firm that you just really can't get at a large firm. And I think that at a smaller firm, you have the ability to sort of build out and create your experience, whereas at a bigger firm, it's, a clogged pipeline approach, right? Like your ideas will go up the pipeline, but it might never make it back out. Whereas, at a smaller firm, if you have a relationship with the managing partner, you can knock in and say, hey, David, X, Y, and Z, this is what I think. What do you think? This is my concern. And I think that leads to a better just work-life balance than the other way around. Even though, with larger firms, you do get that credibility or that status that comes with it. But at what cost, So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so if you're the kind of person that really likes that interpersonal communication and feels like you want to have value and an impact, it sounds like smaller firm is the way to go. If you're looking for that name brand kind of thing, then focus on the bigger firm.
Right. Definitely.
All right. And now my last question for you is you've been active on campus, you've been active and civically engaged. Can you talk about some of the skills that you've been able to develop in those experiences and how it's really helped prepare you for the law field?
Yes. Where do we want to start? So I was on the Black Student Union for all of my time at Binghamton. I think being on the affinity group sort of taught me the advocacy skills that I have today. I'm currently a campaign manager, and they say that once a campaign manager, you're always managing that campaign. And I think that being on the Black Student Union gave me the skill set that I needed to assist my candidate in being elected, right? Because there's also a sort of formality that exists in the student affinity group election process, or, relationship building, or, understanding the needs of different communities and messaging and things of that nature to build that intersectionality. And that's also what you sort of need in, everyday politics. Being on the speech and debate team, obviously taught me how to public speak in a way that is conducive and understanding to most audiences and things like that. And, being a sociology human, from that department, I think that it really just it just heightened my sociological imagination before I knew what a sociological imagination was. I didn't even know that you could put certain terms to, experiences and phenomenons that we have in our lives. And that was like a super important thing. And I was also a REACH scholar, which is, the real education about college health. And that really enhanced my ability to just talk to strangers, random people. Hey, do you need this flu kit? Hey, you should come to our event, right? That's the same thing as, hey, can you sign my petition, to get this candidate on the thing? You know what I mean? All of those experiences shaped me. And that also, being on Binghamton's campus and having it sort of be a microcosm of what the actual world is, right? And the racial breakdown of Binghamton, and that being very, very similar to what, legal professions and legal fields are, not in a good way, right? Like these things are all bad. We should be more inclusive. We should have more, racial ratios that make sense to actual society and states. But being there kind of allowed me to see what the prominent biases are towards certain people and learning how to navigate that in the corporate world or the legal world or the political world. So the negative and positive that came out of Binghamton really shaped the sort of human being that I'm walking around Earth with today.
Yeah, I feel like you almost hit every single competency based on your experience, right? That effective communication, intercultural and global fluency, critical thinking, right? Able to really assess your environment. So sounds like you were able to be really super well rounded. And then also leadership, right? Like learning to take that initiative, reach out to people.
Right, definitely. Yeah, leadership is a really big part of that too. I would say that I've sort of always kind of been in the leadership role my whole life. I've always been that kid that they're like, I know you are behind this. And I'm like, I literally have nothing to do with this. But it really like curved that in an effective way that translated into the real world, gave that maturity to that leadership role. So yeah, definitely.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Monet. And
Thanks
thank
for
you.
having me.
Of course, of course. And thank you to all the students watching. I will see you on the next one.